Shabbat Shalom. So today's message is entitled Hashem's Call to Yisrael, or God's Call to Israel. Israel/Jews. This is a call to all who are of the lineage of Abraham and others. So I'll get to that shortly. But it essentially is the biblical call that God has made to Israel from the very beginning. And the reason for this message really was provoked. It was by a Christian friend who asked a question. I believe it was more of a statement than a question. And it's a question, a statement, a belief that has persisted in the Christian church for the last 2,000 years. Almost from the start, not quite from the start, but certainly from the time of Constantine, it has prevailed in the church, and that is the issue of Jews being Christ killers, and that fomented the Christian persecution of Jews down the ages, and what I say arguably worse than any other persecution of Jews, the Christian persecution of Jews. And so this message was provoked by that statement, that idea, that belief that persists in the Christian church, that the suffering and hardships of the Jews is because they rejected their Messiah. And this is not the case. The rejection of the Messiah has been a symptom of a deeper cause, and so the deeper cause is what I want to get into today, and it is this call of God to Israel is still there. It's the biblical call, and it has never changed, never gone away. And I would say that the Christian church and Orthodox Judaism, there is a great divide between the two, and I would say that both are equally in error. And so this divide will persist as long as both are in error. And so just the most basic error is that the Orthodox Judaism doesn't accept the Messiah, and so as doesn't believe that the new covenant has occurred yet. So the new covenant, as described by the prophet Jeremiah, they don't believe it has occurred yet, and so the Second Testament, or the New Testament, as Christianity would refer to it, the Brit Chadashah, New Covenant, is irrelevant to Orthodox Judaism. On the other hand, Christianity has accepted the Messiah and has this Second Testament, which essentially is a fleshing out of the New Covenant, largely rejects the Tanakh, or the Old Testament as it's known, and so rejects the law, rejects Israel, rejects the Jews. It's all had Israel had its, the Jews had its time, and so now the church, the Christian church, is the new Israel, the new spiritual Israel. So that's another whole story. I mention this just to lay the foundation for what I'm going to say is different to both those two groups. So either one of these two groups is going to either switch off, and so what I just want to start by laying the foundation, particularly because this message really is not just for Israel. but it's focused on Israel. It is for Israel, and it is for Jews, but it is also for Christians, and it is even also for the my atheistic friends who look at the Israel-Palestinian conflict and just see it from a socio-political perspective, and therefore can't understand the issues because they reject the biblical truths. So essentially, biblical truth is different to Christianity and Orthodox Judaism. So all we have to do as human beings, Christians, Orthodox Jews, atheists, everyone, all we have to do is go back to the scriptures, read them like a child, and we will get a better understanding of God's truth than we will from following any particular group. So, the warning that God gives to Israel is he does this through Moshe, through Moses, and we read about it in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the book that Moses wrote just before he died. It is really his final word to Israel before they enter the promised land, Canaan, under Joshua. So Moses he is finished. He spent 40 years leading Israel through the wilderness, and now he is allowed to see the Holy Land, but he's not allowed to enter because of his generation's rebellion. And so he sees it, and he's not allowed to enter, but he writes his final message to Israel, and it's essentially God's word to Israel, and it contains a lot of prophecy, and one very prophetic truth is this warning to Israel. And in chapter 7, verse 1 to 11, he says, "When Yahuwah your God brings you into the land, and you are entering to possess, when Yahuwah your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out many nations before you, the Hittite and the Girgashite and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you, and Yahuwah your God gives them over to you, and you strike them down, then you are to utterly destroy them. You are to make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You are not to intermarry with them. You are not to give your daughter to his son, or take his daughter for your son, for he will turn your son away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of Yahuwah will be kindled against you, and he will swiftly destroy you. Instead, you are to deal with them like this: tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their carved images with fire. For you are a holy people to Yahuwah your God. From all the peoples of the face of the earth, Yahuwah your God has chosen you to be his treasured people. It is not because you are more numerous than all the peoples that Yahuwah set his love on you and chose you, for you are the least of all peoples. Rather, because of his love for you and his keeping the oath he swore to your fathers, Yahuwah brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that Yahuwah your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant kindness for 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his mitzvot. But he repays those who hate him to their face, to annihilate them. He will not hesitate with him who hates him. He will repay him to his face. Therefore, you are to keep the commandment, both the statutes and the ordinances that I am commanding you today, to do them." So the first issue that arises as I read that from an Orthodox Jewish perspective is that I used the name of God. And so now my Jewish friends will be up in arms, because in Orthodox Judaism, you do not pronounce the name of God. Don't even write the name of God. Even the title God is written with a hyphen. And so usually God is referred to as Hashem or Adonai, and I have used his actual name. So there is the first rebellion against God. That's actually not the first. It was actually very late. But I'm pointing it out because I've used it. And so this is going to be the first response to this message from Orthodox Judaism, is that I have dared to use his name. And there will be arguments about the pronunciation of the name. The name is Yud He Vav He, the 4 Hebrew consonants, which many scholars have debated what is the best pronunciation of it. Some circles of Judaism, it is my belief that Orthodox Judaism actually does know the pronunciation and do share the pronunciation in certain cases, but they don't use it. And this was out of the noble idea of not taking God's name in vain, not misusing the name, and that the name is so holy and to be so revered that it's not to be used. Certainly, I would go along with the idea that it is not to be used flippantly, just casually. However, God himself commanded, if you read Exodus 3, 14 and 15, God himself commanded, and a number of other places in Scripture, that what his name is, and that it is the name that he is to be remembered by. And so, although it is a noble idea to not use the name out of reverence for God, it's actually a rebellion, because God commanded that his name be used. He commanded that it be remembered. And if you don't use it, it's not going to be remembered, which is exactly the case we find ourselves in today. It's the reason for the arguments about the pronunciation of the name, because it has not been used, has not been perpetuated, and so people today do not know the name of God. So first off, for my Jewish friends, I will use the name of God. I believe that Yahuwah is the best pronunciation. If you know better, then please let me know, and I'll be sure to investigate it further. But as far as I know, to this point, Yahuwah is to me the best pronunciation of Yud He Vav He, the personal name of God. And so that's the first issue. Getting back to the warning, Moshe warns the people that they are to do 2 things. One, utterly drive out the people of the land of Canaan into which they are going to possess, and not to rebel against God, not to marry their women and give their sons to be married, and in other words, not to mix with those nations. They were to be utterly destroyed, not to be intermingled with. So this is the warning. And then he goes further to say that anyone who does rebel against Yahuwah will be destroyed. They themselves will be destroyed. And so they must worship Yahuwah, their God, the God that brought them out of Egypt, the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. He is the God of Israel. He is the only true living creator of the universe. And so he is the one to be worshipped and honored and magnified. No one else. In chapter 8, verse 19 and 20, he gives further consequences of rejecting, of disobeying. Now, if you forget Yahuwah your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you will certainly perish. Like the nations Yahuwah makes perish before you, so you will perish, since you would not listen to the voice of Yahuwah your God. So this is the warning. And then, if you continue reading, and you read Joshua, you read how Joshua takes the land, and then you will see in Joshua leading Israel into Canaan, and the conquest of Canaan to take the land that God had promised them. They do not do what God commanded them to do. They don't drive out all these 7 nations before them like they were supposed to. There are some left over. And so they do begin to intermarry, and to mix with these nations. And then you get to Judges, and you see in the book of Judges, you see this yo-yo happening. So as Israel rebels against God, mixes with the nations, sets up idols and idol worship, then they begin to suffer hardship. Surrounding nations begin to conquer them and oppress them, and they suffer hardship. And then Israel then cries out to God, and He raises up a judge, and that judge leads them to victory. And so they have a number of years of peace and good as they restore their relationship to God, and then they slide again. And so we have this up and down as Israel rebels and repents and rebels and repents. And ultimately we come to the book of Kings, and in 2 Kings 17 we have just like a summary of this reality, Israel's history and Israel's rebellion. 2 Kings 17 verse 8. I'm going to read 17. I'm going to read up to, I guess I'll read up to 23. Chapter 17 from verse 1. In the 12th year of the king of Achaz of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. He did what was evil in Yahuwah's eyes, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria marched against him. So Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria caught Hoshea conspiring. He had sent messengers to King So of Egypt, and had not paid the tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done every year. Therefore the king of Assyria seized him and put him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded the entire country, marched up to Samaria, and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He placed them in Halah and Chabor on the Gotsan River, and in the towns of the Medes. Now it was so because the men of Israel had sinned against Yahuwah their God, who brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. Instead, they followed the customs of the nations whom Yahuwah had dispossessed before Bnei Yisrael, yet which the kings of Yisrael practiced. Bnei Yisrael secretly did things against Yahuwah their God that were not right. They built shrines for themselves in all their settlements, from watchtower to fortified cities, and they set up pillars and Asherah poles for themselves on every high hill and under every leafy tree. There they burned incense on all the high places, like the nations whom Yahuwah had driven out before them. So they did wicked things to provoke Yahuwah. They worshipped idols, about which Yahuwah had said to them, "You shall not do this thing." Yet Yahuwah had forewarned Yisrael and Judah by the hand of every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways, and keep my commandments and my statutes, according to all the Torah which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you before the hand of my servants the prophets." Yet they would not listen, but stiffened their necks like their fathers, who did not trust in Yahuwah their God. So they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he had made with their fathers, and his testimonies that he testified against them. Instead, they went after futile things and became futile, following the nations that surrounded them, about whom Yahuwah had charged them not to emulate. So they abandoned the mitzvot of Yahuwah their God. So they made for themselves molten images, 2 calves, and made an Asherah pole, and bowed down to all the host of heavens, and worshipped Baal. And they made their sons and daughters pass through the fire, practiced divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil in Yahuwah's eyes, to provoke him. And then he goes on to describe the judgment. So that's up until verse 17. I'm just going to stop there, because you get the picture. It's a summary of what Yisrael then did, and this is now the judgment of the 10 tribes, when the king of Assyria then conquers the 10 tribes and takes them into captivity, and they are dispersed amongst the nations and never seen again. Long story, not quite, but you get the idea. The king of Assyria conquered the 10 northern tribes, and they never returned. Later, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, conquered Judah. Judah and Benjamin were the two southern tribes that held Jerusalem, and ruled from Jerusalem. So the kingdom, Israel, was split into the 10 northern tribes and the two southern tribes. And so Nebuchadnezzar, a couple of hundred years later, conquers Judah and takes Judah into exile. And so they too would be judged. So this is a summary of what they did wrong. And the emphasis that I want to point out and highlight, 3 times he mentions basically compromising with the nations. Those are the nations that surrounded them, the nations that they failed to drive out. So they were amongst them and their neighbors. They compromised with them and began to do what they do and worship their gods. And so in the biblical language, it's in the context of religious worship, religious practices. In our modern day, that kind of worship is not as clear-cut as in the biblical context of religious practices. So I'll get to that in a moment. The point is that Israel had compromised with the nations, and they had sought to do the things that the nations did. Even between the period of the judges and the kings, the desire for a king, which God had warned them against, because God was to be their king. And God ruled through the judges and through prophets. They didn't need a king because God was their king, and he sent his commands, he sent his message. They had the Torah of Moshe, and then they had the prophets and judges to lead them on a practical daily basis. And so they didn't need a king, but they wanted a king. Why? Because of the nations around them. All the other nations had kings. And so God warned them what would happen if they got themselves a king, which is exactly what did happen. When people become kings, when people have absolute authority, they become completely, absolutely corrupt. And so we see that today still in politics and even in celebrities. When people get put up on a pedestal, given power, given recognition and praise and adoration, it goes to their heads, and it becomes a very dangerous thing. So they compromise with the nations. Now, many would say, certainly your rabbis and teachers will tell you that, well, these things happened and these things are done. Now we're entering the time of the promises, because Israel is back in the land. God said that Israel will be restored and brought back to the land. And so 1948, this all happened. So we are in that process. And so essentially what is happening is the confidence is being put into the IDF, the strength of the people Israel, and it's just like at the time of the Babylonian captivity, the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, in which God warned Israel through those 2 prophets in particular, that their other prophets who were prophesying in Babylon were prophesying lies and giving false hope, false confidence, and telling the people that they were going to be restored to Israel and imminently. And so they were false prophets. And so today we have a similar situation in which there is a lot of confidence in Israel, in their strength, in the IDF, in their technological advancements, in all the things that Israel has achieved. And so my conviction and my warning today is that these warnings that have been given through Moshe, through the prophets, and through the reality of Israel's history, those captivities of Assyria and Babylon are not the full and final fulfillment of the prophecies and the warnings. So those warnings still apply. Those warnings still exist. And we are in the time today in which they are very, very, very significant and to be adhered to or taken note of. So Jeremiah 30 verse 7 talks about Jacob's trouble, the time of Jacob's trouble, a time like no other, a time that will be terrible like no other. And many will say, that rabbis will say that these things were fulfilled in Babylonian captivity. But if we read Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 8 and 9, it will be in that day, it is a declaration of Yahuwah Tsabaoth, that I will break his yoke from off your neck and I will tear off your bonds. Foreigners will no longer enslave him. Instead, they will serve Yahuwah their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. So there is an element, this is now after the time of Jacob's trouble, after the difficulties and hardships and persecutions, in which all Israel will turn back to their God. And they will worship their God as their king. They will worship their God and David as their king. And so David, we know, and the rabbis will know, and if you're Orthodox Jew, you will know the hope. This is the Mashiach. This is the hope, the king of the lineage of David, to sit on David's throne and rule as king in Israel. And so this is the fulfillment. This is the full and final fulfillment, which has not happened yet. All Israel has not turned back to their God. On the contrary, and David has not entered and is not sitting on the throne. And other prophecies further, it's from then on forever. And so it will be, the Mashiach will come and reign forever. There's not going to be then another conquest and he's going to be overthrown and someone else and then it's going to continue. No, when Mashiach comes, it will then be forever. And so that's another long story, because everyone's going to say to me, well, we only live until so long and then we die. So that's another long story. But my point being is that if you read the prophecies, you want to know if they've been finally fulfilled, then every detail of the prophecy must be done. We must see it has happened in history. So there are elements of these prophecies which have not yet been fulfilled. Therefore, what has happened historically is not the final fulfillment of the prophecy. And so we can expect it to be either a part fulfillment, and so the second part of the prophecy is still to come, or it's a type. It's an example of the prophecy that will happen again more fully in a future date. So we see Jeremiah, it hasn't been fulfilled. Zechariah 13, we see from both Zechariah 13 and Jeremiah that these things have not yet been fulfilled, and so they are still warnings to be adhered to, paid attention to, taken note of. Zechariah 13 verse 7 to 9. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is my companion. It is a declaration of Yahuwah Tsabaoth. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. Then it will happen. It is a declaration of Yahuwah that in the entire land 2/3 will be cut off and die, but 1/3 will be left in it. This third I will bring through the fire. I will refine them as silver is refined, and will test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, Yahuwah is my God. Behold, the day of Yahuwah is coming, when your plunder will be divided in your midst. I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to wage war. The city shall be captured, the houses ransacked, and the women ravished. Half of the city will be exiled, but the remainder of the people will not be cut off from the city. So there, if you continue reading, chapter 14, verse 16, it says, after all of this and the restoration has happened, Then all the survivors from all the nations that attacked Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King Yahuwah Sabaoth and to celebrate Sukkot. So even the nations that came against Israel, that were judged and were destroyed by Mashiach, it's a long story, it's described, even there, the survivors of those nations will then so in other words, all nations of the world will come to Jerusalem, or send representatives to Jerusalem, to the feast of Sukkot, tabernacles. And so if they don't, they won't get any rain. So this has not happened. And so this judgment, that we read in chapter 13, Babylonian captivity could be a type, could be a part of the prophecy, but it certainly is not the final prophecy, because the rest of it hasn't happened yet. Certainly at the time of the siege of Jerusalem, there was great famine, great distress. Mothers were eating their own children. And so it is a terrible, terrible, we've just had the horrible events of October 7th. Not just, it's now a year and a bit away. But the unfolding of the hostage issues that we are seeing, as horrendous as they are, it's not the worst that Israel has experienced. And certainly if we read the prophecies of Jeremiah, Zechariah, we see that the final judgment, the time of Jacob's trouble, the final trouble is worse than anything before. And so if we read Psalm 137, there we saw in Zechariah that women will be ravished. If you read Psalm 137, it's a prayer that people don't like that struggle with, especially Christians. Well, I suppose anyone who is moral and loves life, and we know that the Jews certainly love life and are devoted to their children. And so it is a terrible prayer. It is the time of the Babylonian captivity, and they are going to Babylon, and their captors ask them to sing songs because they were known for their music. So they have harps, the 10-string lyre, and so their captors ask them to sing songs of mirth. And so they say, by the rivers of Babel, we sat down and wept. When we remembered Sion, on the willows there we hung our harps. In other words, they hung up their harps. They refused to sing songs of mirth. When they were in captivity in Babylon, thinking of Jerusalem, they refused. For there our captors demanded songs, and our tormentors asked for joy. Sing us one of the songs of Sion. How can we sing a song of Yahuwah in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I cease to remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember Yahuwah, the children of Edom, what they said on the day Jerusalem fell. Strip her to her very foundation. O daughter of Babel, the devastated one, happy is the one who repays you as you have paid us. Happy is the one who seizes your little ones and dashes them upon the rock. So the prayer there, they're not wishing, they're not intending to dash their little ones on the rock. What they're praying there is that this is what they did to us. And so the prayer is for vengeance on their enemies, that someone will do to them what they do to us. And so in Israel's history, in Israel's experience of all the suffering we know of, they too had their little ones dashed on the rocks. We know what happened during the siege of Jerusalem when they were starving to death, and all these terrible things that have happened to Israel throughout its history. These things are ultimately because Israel was created by God to be the priestly nation that revealed the Creator God of heaven and earth, the Creator of all humanity, our Creator. Israel was the nation that was supposed to represent that God and introduce that God to the people of the earth. Not to hold it for themselves, not to think of themselves. We read it in the Psalm. That was it, the Psalm. Not because they are a great nation, there's anything great about Israel. It is for God's glory. And so their responsibility, the scriptures also say with privilege comes responsibility. And so with great responsibility comes great privilege. And so they have been blessed. And this is the reason why they can achieve what Israel, Jewish people, are so gifted in so many ways. I believe I have another message called Israel First. And I explain the reasons why Jews in general excel. And with that privilege comes great responsibility. That responsibility biblically was to represent the Creator God and to introduce people, to call people to repent and return to their God, their Creator. And so rather than doing that, Israel itself turned against its own God. This God who created them to be this mouthpiece for Him and to demonstrate Him to the world. So they themselves, rather than doing that, gave up the privilege and tried to be just like the world. And so this is the crux of my message today, is because many will be saying, oh, well, that's all old news and that's what happened. And we don't serve idols. We don't make Asherah poles. We don't make sculptures of Baal and fall down and worship them. We don't make our children pass through the fire. That was child sacrifice. I must spell it out. And so we don't do those things. In fact, we don't want any religion. We don't want to be religious. We just want to be left alone and continue our life like the rest of the world. And therein is the problem, because that was the problem. So we look at all these things like making your children pass through the fire and the Asherah poles, and we think, well, oh, that stuff's very obvious. That wasn't the problem. Those were symptoms of the problem. The problem was that they wanted to be like the world. They wanted to be like their neighbors. They wanted to have what they had and do what they did and blend in and just be like them. Israel, Jews, for the most part, for the last couple of 100 years, have had the same ideals, the same ambitions, just to be like the rest, to be left alone. Many secular Jews today, I've encountered a number who don't want to hear that they're the chosen people. They don't want to know that they're the chosen race, because it just puts a target on their back. They just want to blend in. They just want to be like everyone else. Just blend in with everyone else. Live my life peaceably and happily and make my fortune and live comfortably, just like everyone else. I'm not chosen. I'm not nothing. I'm just like everyone else. That is the problem. That is essentially idolatry. It is putting something else in the place of your God. It is putting your focus, your hope and security in something else other than your God. It doesn't have to be an Asherah pole. It doesn't have to be a golden calf. It doesn't have to be an altar or a child sacrifice. It's anything that you put your trust in other than God is essentially an idol. And for the most part, Israel and Jews globally are, I haven't looked at statistics, but I would confidently say that the majority are secular, and so it's a rejection of God. I'm an example of this desire to blend in with the nations. My family originate in Poland, Polish Jews, and the pogroms, 1600s in Poland, they escaped to Holland, and one of them, my namesake, Matthias Galitz, ended up in the Cape Colony with the Dutch East India Company. Today, I will not be recognized as Jewish because our family stopped practicing Judaism, stopped being Jewish, stopped going to synagogue, stopped being members of the Jewish community. And so today I would not be, and that is an illustration of this blending in to the world, blending into just becoming like the world. In summary, then, God's call to Yisrael has always been the same from the very beginning. And so I'll close with just 3 passages from the book of Deuteronomy, from the foundation of Yisrael, from when Moshe warned Yisrael of what was to come, of what would be the result of following Yud He Vav He, Yahuwah, or of rejecting Yahuwah. Chapter 26, from verse 16, it says, "This day Yahuwah your God is commanding you to do these statutes and ordinances, so you are to take care to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. Today you have affirmed Yahuwah as your God, that you will walk in his ways, keep his statutes, mitzvot, and ordinances, and listen to his voice. Now, today, Yahuwah has affirmed you as his treasured people, as he promised you, that you are to keep all his mitzvot, that he will set you high above all the nations he has made, for praise, fame, and honor, and that you are to be a holy people to Yahuwah your God, as he promised." So this was when Moshe, before they came into the promised land. As I said before, Deuteronomy is his final, essentially, letter to Israel, his final warning, his final words of instruction. In chapter 29, from verse 9, "You are standing today, all of you, before Yahuwah your God, the heads of your tribes, your elders, your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your wives, and the outsider within your camp, from your wood chopper to your water carrier. Each of you is to cross over into the covenant of Yahuwah your God that he is cutting with you today, and into his oath. This is in order to confirm you today as his people. So he will be your God, just as he promised you, and just as he swore to your fathers, to Avram, to Yitzhak, and to Yaakov. Not with you alone am I cutting this covenant and this oath, but with whomever is standing here with us today before Yahuwah our God, and with whomever is not here with us today." Even though many do not know and do not understand, the Christians are grafted into the root of Yisrael. And so Christians too are included in this covenant relationship and in the people who are called God's people, his people. And many who are ethnically Jews are not God's people because they reject him. So this is the call to return to God. And it's a call, as I said in the beginning, not just to Israel, not just to Jews, but to all people of the earth, because God is our God. He is the creator of heaven and earth. He is the one and only true God. And so all Israel's mandate was to deliver that message and to draw all nations to their creator. And then finally, chapter 30, from verse 11. For this mitzvah, commandment, for this mitzvah that I am commanding you today is not difficult for you, nor is it far off. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who will go up for us to the heavens and get it for us and have us hear it so we may do it. Nor is it across the sea that you should say, who will cross over for us to the other side of the sea and get it for us and have us hear it so we may do it. No, the word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to do it. So I have set before you today life and good health, death and evil. What I'm commanding you today is to love Yahuwah your God, to walk in his ways and to keep his mitzvot, statutes and ordinances, that you will live and multiply, and Yahuwah your God will bless you in the land you are going in to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not listen, but are drawn away and bow down to other gods and worship them, I tell you today that you will certainly perish. You will not prolong your days on the land where you are about to cross over the Yarden to go in to possess. I call the heavens and the earth to witness about you today that I've set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore, choose life, so that you and your descendants may live, by loving Yahuwah your God, listening to his voice and clinging to him. For he is your life and the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land that Yahuwah swore to your fathers, to Avram, to Yitzhak, and to Yaakov, to give them. There is coming a day, and it's not far off, in which the land will be returned to Israel. 1948 was not the final fulfillment of the promise. When God does it, when Yahuwah does it, through his Mashiach, which is another story we can get onto later, when that land, when Israel is fully restored to the land, it will be forever. No more battle, no more war, only justice, life and love. Shabbat Shalom. I hope you hear this message. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.